Imagine stepping back in time to August 15th, 1947. You're part of a huge crowd in Delhi watching as the British flag, the Union Jack, is lowered for the very last time. After almost 200 years of ruling India, the jewel of their empire, Britain's control ends suddenly. But it wasn't out of kindness or a change of heart. No, it was because Britain was flat broke. World War II had wrecked their economy, pushing their national debt to over 200% of their GDP. Their treasury was empty, and without stealing India's riches, they couldn't keep funding their vast empire. Few people know this, but India's freedom wasn't a generous gift from Britain. It was more like a financial bailout gone wrong. A surrender because they couldn't afford to hold on. The British Empire didn't hand over independence. They just couldn't pay the bills anymore. And when India broke free, the whole imperial system started crumbling. To really get why this empire fell, we need to rewind to its beginnings. Go back to December 31st, 1600. Queen Elizabeth I signs a royal charter, giving a group of English traders special rights to trade with lands east of Africa and west of the Pacific. This became the East India Company, and it grew into the most powerful business the world had ever seen. At first, it seemed innocent, just buying and selling spices, fabrics, and tea. But soon, it acted like its own country. By the 1700s, it had a private army of 260,000 soldiers, bigger than Britain's official military. This company had its own money, its own troops, and even its own mini-empire. The big shift happened in 1757 at the Battle of Plassey. After beating the Nawab of Bengal, the company got the Diwani, a right to collect taxes in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. That gave them power over 30 million people in one of the richest areas on earth. In just a few years, they went from traders to rulers, collecting taxes and taking advantage of everyone. They controlled salt, tobacco, and opium, making Indian workers sell their goods for 40% less than fair prices. Skilled weavers who had made the world's best fabrics for centuries were turned into forced laborers. Then, in 1769 to 1770, the Bengal famine hit. Between 7 and 10 million people died. The company didn't help. They kept collecting taxes as if nothing happened. They taxed people until they starved. This wasn't a mistake. It was their plan. By 1750, India produced a quarter of the world's factory goods. By 1900, that dropped to just 2%. Why? Britain didn't just take over India. They shut down its industries. They flooded Indian markets with cheap British products, free of taxes, while piling heavy fees on local makers. British factories bought India's raw cotton cheaply, turned it into cloth, and sold it back at a huge profit, killing off competition. From 1850 to 1896, British textile imports to India jumped from 5 million to 18 million pieces. India's famous weavers lost everything. Between 1600 and 1871, India's wealth per person fell from over 60% of Britain's level to under 15%. It was planned, it was cruel, and it made Britain incredibly wealthy. Next came even worse corruption, the opium trade. The East India Company turned into the world's biggest drug dealer, forcing farmers to grow opium and shipping it to China for silver and tea. When China fought back against this addiction, Britain started the Opium Wars in 1839 and 1842, and won. They went to war to protect their drug profits. Opium became Britain's second biggest income source, right after land taxes. India was like a giant farm and a victim all at once. In 1857, Indian soldiers in the company's army rebelled. It was one of the biggest uprisings against colonial rule. Britain crushed it violently and made India pay the bill. The cost of putting down the revolt went straight onto Indian taxpayers. They funded their own defeat. After that, the British government took over India directly, ending the company but ramping up the exploitation. They reorganized the army with 65,000 British troops and 140,000 Indian ones, all paid for by Indian taxes. Half of India's money went to the empire's military. People often praise the railways as Britain's great gift to India, but the reality is harsher. From 1860 to 1890, India's rail network grew from 1,130 to 25,000 kilometers, but it was built with Indian debt. Rules said all equipment had to come from Britain, so India borrowed money, paid for the work, and Britain kept the profits. These trains moved British soldiers and goods, not to help Indians. Economist Dadabhai Naoroji called this the drain of wealth. He figured Britain took $30 to $40 million from India each year, but put back less than $250,000. He said it was like a vampire sucking the life out of the country, and he was spot on. When money leaves and never comes back, a nation suffers. This drain got worse during the World Wars. By 1918, Over 1 million Indian soldiers fought for Britain in places like Gallipoli, France, and Mesopotamia. More than 150,000 died or got hurt. India also sent millions of tons of wheat, cotton, timber, and supplies, most paid for by India. They even gave Britain a $100 million gift for the war. In World War II, the British Indian Army grew to 3.35 million soldiers, the biggest volunteer force ever. Britain paid for the war by issuing IOUs called sterling balances, huge debts to India. By 1945, India was Britain's top creditor. Then came the 1943 Bengal famine, a disaster caused by human choices that killed 800,000 to 3.8 million people. While Indians starved, Britain sent food to Europe. Winston Churchill said coldly that Indians should handle their own problems. He even wanted India to pay Britain for defense, using the famine to wipe out debts. It was the height of imperial greed. By war's end, Britain was ruined. Their debt was twice their economy's size, exports had crashed, and the empire was bankrupt. The US lent $3.75 billion, and Canada $1.9 billion. Loans Britain didn't fully repay until 2006, but without India's wealth, the empire couldn't keep going. On June 3, 1947, Britain said they were leaving. By August 15th, the flag came down. It wasn't an act of kindness. It was a desperate pullout. In 1700, India made up 27% of the world's economy. By 1947, it was down to 4%. Britain's share rose from 2.9% to 9% during its peak of taking from colonies. For 200 years, Britain's growth meant India's loss. When the money drain stopped, the empire did too. After independence, India rebuilt. In 1947, people lived an average of 27 years. By 2000, that doubled. In just decades of ruling itself, India did more than 190 years of British development ever achieved. Britain won wars but lost its empire. The Commonwealth replaced colonies, and by the 1960s, most territories were gone. An empire that once controlled a quarter of the world faded away. But history has a way of echoing. Today, the United States is like Britain was. A superpower with 750 overseas bases, trillions in war debt, and a strained financial system. Britain's power came from stealing from colonies. America's comes from the dollar's global dominance, trade deals, and military force. But when debts pile up and empire costs exceed gains, decline starts. Just as Britain fell when India escaped, America might face its own downfall if the dollar loses its hold. Britain's debt hit 200% of GDP by 1945. America's isn't far behind. History shows what comes next. Empires don't crash overnight. They slowly bleed from arrogance, overspending, and thinking power is eternal. The British Empire's huge mistake wasn't just money. It was moral, believing you can take from the world forever without payback. And when the bill arrived, the sun that never set on their empire finally went down. If you're finding this story of empires and economics fascinating, take a second to hit that subscribe button right in the center of your screen. We'll keep exploring how past mistakes shape today's money world. Don't miss out. Now, let's dig deeper into some key figures and events that really highlight how this financial drain worked. Take Dadabhai Naoroji, for example. Born in 1825 in Bombay, he was one of India's first economists and a leader in the independence movement. Naoroji studied in England, becoming a professor and even a member of the British Parliament, but he saw firsthand how Britain exploited India. In his book Poverty and Un-British Rule in India, published in 1901, he broke down the numbers. Britain was pulling out about 30 to 40 million pounds a year from India, money that could have built schools, hospitals, or factories back home. He called it a drain because it was like blood being sucked out, leaving India weak and poor. Naoroji's ideas inspired leaders like Mahatma Gandhi, who used economic arguments to push for freedom. Imagine if more people had listened to him earlier. Maybe the empire's fall would have come sooner, saving millions from famine and hardship. Speaking of famines, the Bengal one in 1943 wasn't just a natural disaster. It was a direct result of wartime policies. Britain diverted ships and resources to feed its own troops and allies in Europe, while India faced shortages. Rice exports to other parts of the empire continued, even as locals starved. Historians estimate that if Britain had shared just a fraction of the food it controlled, hundreds of thousands could have been saved. This wasn't oversight. It was a choice, driven by the same greed that fueled the opium trade and the Opium Wars. Let's expand on those. The First Opium War 1839-1842 started when China banned the drug, seeing it as a threat to its people. Britain, backed by the East India Company, sent warships and forced China to open ports, pay huge reparations, and legalize opium. The Second War 1860 was even worse, leading to the burning of Beijing's Summer Palace. All this to protect a trade that made Britain rich but addicted millions in China. By the mid-1800s, opium was China's biggest import, causing social collapse and rebellions. Economically, it flipped the trade balance. China went from a surplus to a deficit, sending silver to Britain. This silver helped fund Britain's Industrial Revolution, but at what cost? It set a pattern for how empires use drugs and debt to control others. Now let's talk about the railways, often called Britain's gift to India. Sure, they connected cities and boosted trade, but the motives were military and economic, not humanitarian. The first railway line opened in 1853, built by British engineers with Indian labor. But the contracts were rigged. All steel, engines, and tools came from Britain, inflating costs. India borrowed from British banks at high interest, and by 1900, the railway debt was a massive burden. These trains carried British goods cheaply across India, undercutting local producers, and moved troops quickly to crush revolts like the 1857 uprising. In fact, the railways helped Britain extract resources faster. Cotton from the south, wheat from the north, all shipped to ports for export. Post-independence, India kept expanding the network, turning it into a real asset. Today, India's railways are the world's largest employer, moving billions of passengers. But back then, it was just another tool for the drain. Shifting to the World Wars, India's role was huge but underpaid. In World War I, Indian troops fought in brutal conditions, from the muddy trenches of the Somme to the deserts of Mesopotamia. They were promised better treatment, but racism was rampant. Indian soldiers got lower pay and worse food than British ones. The gift of 100 million rupees? It was a loan, really forced on India to show loyalty. By World War II, the scale was epic. The British Indian Army wasn't just big. It was diverse, with soldiers from every corner of India. They fought in Africa, Italy, and Burma, suffering huge losses. Yet, Britain used India's resources to fund the war, issuing those sterling balances as IIUs. After the war, Britain tried to devalue the rupee to pay less, sparking protests. This economic manipulation delayed India's recovery and fueled the push for independence. On the modern side, let's expand on America's parallels. The US dollar's dominance is like Britain's pound during its empire days. Since World War II, the dollar has been the world's reserve currency, meaning most global trade happens in dollars. This lets the US borrow cheaply and print money without inflation hitting hard at home. But it's not free. America maintains 750 military bases in over 80 countries, costing hundreds of billions annually. Debt? The US national debt is over $34 trillion, about 120% of GDP, and rising due to wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and now Ukraine support. Just like Britain drained India, the US benefits from global trade imbalances. Countries like China hold trillions in US treasuries, funding American spending. But if trust in the dollar fades, say, due to inflation or rivals like China's yuan gaining ground, the US could face a crisis. Economists warn that overspending on military and entitlements could lead to a fiscal cliff, where borrowing costs soar. History rhymes. Rome fell when it couldn't afford its legions. Spain collapsed after overextending in the Americas. America might not lose an empire like Britain did, but it could see its influence wane if debts keep piling up. What lessons can we draw for personal finance? Empires teach us about debt cycles. Britain borrowed to build its empire, then couldn't pay back. Today, many nations and people do the same. Credit card debt, student loans, housing bubbles. The key is balance. Spend on growth, but don't drain resources forever. For investors, colonial history shows how commodities like opium or cotton drove profits, but also risks. Modern parallels. Think of how oil or tech giants extract wealth from developing countries. Ethical investing is rising. Funds that avoid empire-like exploitation. Looking at other fallen empires adds perspective. The Roman Empire lasted 500 years but crumbled under debt from endless wars and inflation. By the 5th century, the silver denarius had lost 95% of its value. Spain's empire peaked in the 1500s with gold from the Americas, but overspending on armies led to bankruptcy in 1557. They borrowed from bankers, defaulted multiple times, and lost power. The Ottoman Empire drained wealth from conquered lands. but corruption and wars bankrupted it by the early 1900s. All these show a pattern. Empires rise on extraction, fall on exhaustion. For today's world, climate change could be the new drain. Rich nations exploiting poorer ones for resources, leading to global instability. India's post-independence story is inspiring. After 1947, leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru focused on self-reliance. The Green Revolution in the 1960s boosted food production, ending famines. GDP grew from $50 billion in 1950 to over $3 trillion today. Life expectancy, literacy, and tech exports soared. But challenges remain: poverty, inequality, and debt from colonial legacies. Yet, India's rise shows resilience. From 4% of global GDP in 1947 to projected 7% by 2030. It's a reminder that breaking free from financial drains leads to growth. In wrapping up, the British Empire's story is a cautionary tale for any superpower. Power built on taking from others isn't sustainable. As we see with the US, the costs of maintaining global dominance, military, economic, moral, can lead to decline. But there's hope. Learning from history, nations can choose fair trade, debt management, and shared prosperity. Empires fall, but people rebuild. If you made it to the end of this epic journey through finance and empires, you're clearly hooked on these stories. Subscribe now to stay updated with more videos on how history shapes our money today, whether it's ancient debts or modern markets. And if this video sparked your curiosity, smash that like button and share it with friends. What's your take on empire economics? Drop a comment below. Until next time, keep questioning the flow of wealth.